Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ui Teramoto. We are going to start the symposium organized by SARC. Thank you so much for coming here. I am a member of SARC, South Asia Research Center, Soka University, and will be the master of ceremony for this symposium today. On behalf of South Asia Research Center, Soka University, Japan, I warmly welcome you all, respected professors, scholars, and students from different parts of the world to this wonderful symposium organized by SARC. This symposium is the first event toward our international conference, which will be held in November this year. The conference is entitled as Representations of Asia in History and Literature. Today, we have invited distinguished speakers to initiate this academic pursuit of SARC this year, focusing on representations of India in Japanese literature. Before we begin the session, let me introduce our guest speakers today. Firstly, Professor Anne-Susan Alias. Professor Alias is a teaching faculty at the Department of English, St. Stephen's College in India. While her area of doctoral research is on the folk traditions amongst the Syrian Christians of Kerala, India, she has also explored the allied areas such as women's writing, post-colonial studies, and modern theater. She has also been a kind supporter for Soka University and taught Soka students during their visit to St. Stephen's College for short programs. Welcome, Professor Alias. It is our great pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you. It is my honor. Thank you.
Our another speaker today is Professor Mukesh Williams, who is a renowned scholar in literature and, of course, advisor to SARC. Professor Williams is a university educator, author, and a poet. He has taught Anglo-American, South Asian, and global literature for many decades. He has also co-authored a book called Representing India, published from Oxford University Press, which provides a critical commentary on politics, language, literature, identity, religion, and so on. So we have today two esteemed scholars here with us, and we are delighted to have you both today. Thank you so much for being here. So first, I'd like to invite Professor Williams to the stage. So over to you, Professor Williams.
Thank you. Thank you, Teramoto Sensei. Thank you very much. And Susan, thank you very much. And I'm very happy to be in your company to speak today about representations of India in Japanese literature. So let me begin. Well, for Japanese writers, India was a faraway land. And they created an imaginary world around it. They used fables and fantasies from Buddhist cosmology and Hindu spirituality to write about India. Their worldview was connected to images of prehistory before historical documentation. These images had a lasting impact on Japanese literature. So today we accept religious and secular texts that have been transcribed as literature. But stories that have morphed, transformed, and changed into artifacts are not considered literature. So Hindu spirituality and the Buddhist worldview. This intrigued Japanese writers. They tried to integrate these themes into their stories. Japanese writers saw India as Tenjiku, or a pure faraway land from which they could enrich their culture. With the reincarnation of Bodhisattva Monjushiri in Japan, the shift in Indian cosmology became important. The seat of religious power shifted from India to China and then to Japan. This is very important because it authenticated the power of Buddhist tales and traditions and the Hindu text subsequently. So today I will talk about 7 different conceptions of the world in Japanese writers. The first, the Tenjiku worldview. The second, the Buddhist cosmological worldview. The third, the Asiatic mind worldview. The fourth, reincarnation worldview. The fourth, is it the fourth? Inner transformation worldview. Then you have the Ganga Moksha worldview. And finally, life as chaos worldview. So Japanese writers like Okakura Tenshin, Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Yukio Mishima, Shusaku Endo, and Yuka Ishii. These writers emphasized the conceptions of the Asian mind, the Jatak tales, reincarnation, moksha, and chaos, historical chaos. India survives in Japanese literature through its rich spirituality, its rich religious tradition. And out of this, a very fantastic fictional world is constructed. Let me take up the first worldview, the Tenjiku worldview. Now, Tenjiku described India as more imaginary than real. Tenjiku was connected to the birthplace of Buddhism. Tenjiku could have come from the Sanskrit word Sindh, which meant the watershed of the Indus River. It meant heaven. It is pronounced as Taizenzu from the Indian word Sindhu. It appeared recently in Japanese manga series Tokyo Revengers, written by Ken Wakui. There is a gang of Yokohama delinquents who appear as Tenjiku. So they fight other gangs to create what is called a Tenjiku arc. So interestingly, the motto of Tenjiku gang is Masakatsu Agatsu, which means true victory is victory over oneself. True victory is victory over oneself. Sounds very Buddhist. The martial way of Aikido. So India preached the unity of self and others. And it also showed ways to overcome self-centeredness. So from the 6th century, the Japanese worldview constructed the existence of 3 countries: Sangoku Seikaikan, which is Honcho, Japan, Shintan, China, and Tenjiku, India. But for 700 years, this kind of thinking survived. Only in the 16th century, when the Portuguese and the Jesuit missionaries, like Francis Xavier, came to Japan, the worldview of the 5 continents emerged. Godaishu. Asia, Europe, Africa, America, and Melanesia, or the Southern Hemisphere. This conception of the 5 continents replaced the old conception of the world as Tenjiku. So the Portuguese were referred to as Tenjiku Jin, or Tenjiku people. So the Portuguese, because they preached the doctrine of Christianity, they came through India, a lot of them, as called Lashkar soldiers, or Lashkar naval soldiers. The Tenjiku Shu became a sect of Buddhism. Christianity was called Tenjiku Shu, and it became a sect of Buddhism. It's quite strange. So, but anyway, Tenjiku was the other. And against Tenjiku, the Japanese constructed their national identity. So in the Meiji period, Japanese writers gave up the Tenjiku conception and imagined a new country to enter the new world. The second is the Buddhist cosmological conception or worldview. Buddhist cosmological worldview. So during the 8th century, the concept of reincarnation was readily accepted in Asia. It elevated certain individuals to the status of reincarnated beings. So Bodhisena endorsed the shift of reincarnation by identifying Gyoki as the reincarnation of Manjushri, whom he had met at Eagle Peak. So the Gyoki, Bosatsuden, and Nihon Ryoki refer to the popularity of ideas connected with the emergence of bodhisattvas in Japan. So this became connected with the rise of Manjushri cult in Japan. Now this shifted the center of the Buddhist world from China to Japan. India, anyway, it was shifted. The Manusri Parinivas Sutra, or Parinirvana Sutra, confirmed the belief that Manjushri will appear in human form before his devotees. Bodhisena gave validity to the Buddhist dharma. And the Japanese emperor, Shomo, he became the supreme protector of the Buddhist religion. So he introduced Sanskrit in temples. Bodhisena introduced on the advice of the emperor, and classical music and dances in Japanese courts. And this shifted the cosmic center of Buddhism from India to China to Japan. Now it was Japan that was the center. It is believed that Bodhisena introduced Hindu esoteric and tantric practices, like the opening of the eyes ceremony. Children games like Daruma and Karuta, and magical properties of phenomena through tantric rituals. I removed a lot of stuff about Gyoki and so on, and now come to the third section, which is the Asiatic mind worldview. So Okakura Tenshin visited India in 1901 and 1902. And he met Vivekananda, Tagore, and Sister Nivedita. She was a French woman. A year later, he wrote Ideals of the East. And the first sentence of the book, which came from Sister Nivedita, was, Asia is one. Asia is one. And this became a mantra for all Pan-Asianists. Tenshin realized the spiritual unity of Asia. And he felt it must prevail in the world. Tenshin also introduced the concept of Gotenjiku, or the 5 Indies, which was a Sino-Japanese Buddhist concept. It gave a prominent place to China, a smaller place to Japan, and the southern islands and Europe. But there is a lot of detail here which I would not like to talk about now, but if there is a question session, perhaps I will talk about this. The fourth is reincarnation worldview. Now here we have Mishima, Yukio Mishima. He was preoccupied with death and created a fascination with karma and reincarnation. It was a kind of ambivalent perspective to reincarnation, but I would pursue this in this vein. So he developed nihilism and self-doubt in his writing. His images and symbols set the tone for later writers like Endo and Ishii to represent India. In Mishima, the main character, Honda, he questions whether the reincarnations of his friend are the figment of his imagination. Is he only the one who sees reincarnation? And if that is so, is it a figment of his imagination? Mishima wrote a series of 4 novels that deal with the 4 reincarnation as a single unit. And of his school friend, Kyoaki Matsugai. So Kyoaki Matsugai in one reincarnation is an aristocrat. In another one, he's a nationalist. In a third one, he's a Thai princess. And fourth, he is an orphan, a selfish orphan. Honda tells all his stories. All these stories are told by Honda. Matsugai is Honda's friend, and he thinks he understands his friend very well. His friend carries a deep karma of meeting an untimely death. So when the stories begin, Honda is a law student. That is 1912. When the story ends, he's a retired judge, rich retired judge, 1975. So in a span of 63 years, Matsugai goes through 3 reincarnations. So the 4 stories within the fertility as spring, the fertility of spring, I don't want to talk about them, but yeah, they are the 4 spring snow, runaway horses, temple of dawn, and decay the aged. Honda wants to save his friend from an untimely death in all these, and he doesn't succeed. Mishima's belief and disbelief in Indian esoteric ideas became the basis. This is the important point. It became the basis for subsequent Japanese writers like Endo and Ishii. You would find similar images of journey, river, purification, reincarnation, re-emergence, and so on. How am I doing with the time? Is it okay? How much time do I have?
Perhaps another 10 minutes.
Okay. The 5th worldview is the inner transformation world. What we called once upon a time tales, Mukashi. These were available in Konjaku Monogatari Shu, or Anthology of Tales from the Past. So this was composed in 794 to 1185, and there were about 31 volumes, and I'm given to believe that only 25 survive. Now, they are stories from India, from China, and from Japan. Akutagawa and many other writers were deeply influenced by these stories. And Akutagawa is known as the father of Japanese short stories. His story, The Spider Thread, I just took out one, his spider's thread. It appeared in Rashomon and 17 other stories, which was published in 1918. It deals with a selfish man named Kandata, who falls back into hell for not helping others. Buddha, standing at the edge of the lotus lake, understands Kandata's predicament, and he feels sad. Directly beneath the lotus pond of paradise lay the lower depths of hell, Akutagawa writes. And as he peered, this is Buddha, he is Buddha, it is capitalized. As he peered through the crystalline water, he could see the river of three crossings and the mountain of needles as clearly as if he were viewing picture in a peep box. Kandata grasped the spider's thread and started climbing. But on the way, he saw countless sinners climbing this very same thread, like a column of ants, Then Kandata shouted, "This spider thread is mine. Who said you could climb it? Get off, get off." At that instant, the spider thread broke with a snap. Kandata fell back into hell once more. Looking up, he saw the broken thread delicately gleaming in the moonless, starless sky. The lotus continued to bloom unperturbed, spreading its sweet fragrance. So this ends the inner transformation, the need for inner transformation, and how Kandata lacks that inner transformation. Number 6 is the Ganga Moksha worldview. So rivers symbolize a voyage, a goal, great cleansing, death, or resolution. Rivers often become the central symbol in a novel, around which most of the action takes place. In Japanese novels, there are few occasions when rivers in a foreign land become powerful symbols of redemption and also confusion. Shusaku Endo's 1993 novel, Deep River, and Yuka Ishii's 2017 novel, Hyakunen Doro, 100 Years Mud, are separated by over 2 decades, but they nevertheless share a common theme: the spiritual purification and physical chaos of Indian rivers. There is no comparison between the Ganga River and the Adyar River, but both enter the Bay of Bengal. Ganga is 3,000 kilometers and Adyar is a very small 42 kilometers long. So, but the rich symbolism and spirituality of the Ganga are overpowering, and they tower over the muddy chaos of Adyar. Endo shows moments of realization in his Japanese characters as they encounter the Ganga. Ishii shows the chaos and the confusion that arises with the flooding of the Adyar. Endo's very realistic style, it captures the slow-moving past and the fast-moving present. It kind of imitates the slow turbidity and the fast-flowing waters of the Ganga. Ishii uses flashbacks to capture present events, but this breaks both logic and realism. So Endo creates epiphanies through his realism. Ishii introduces intensities through what today we call magic realism. So these two pictures of India are quite different. Endo reveals the different cultural perspectives of urban materialism and urban spirituality. Both are there. Ishii talks about the disembodied identity of the mud and artifacts of a century that are thrown up because of the flood. So the Ganga River becomes a symbol of life, of love, purification, depending on the way each character approaches it. So each of the spiritual tourists discover the true meaning of love along the river as they move along the river. They understand how the water of the river manifests itself in nature, the human body, and beyond, moksha. So becoming one with the Ganga River means being purified and liberated. So the Ganga River is deep because it is for all. It is deep because it takes you beyond life and death. Mitsuko sums up the meaning of the river by saying it's a deep river, so deep I feel as though it's not just for the Hindus, but for everyone. The last worldview is the life as chaos worldview. Shakunendoro, 100 Years Mud, is based on the floods in Chennai in 2015. And this novel got the Aktagawa Award as the best novel. So you can see the connection that flows through these writers. This flood caused widespread destruction, and wading through the mud, the main character, the protagonist, discovers not only the history of Chennai, but also the history of Osaka, where she was born. So the first person narration in the cauldron of what we call magic realism helps the writer to enter into her own life. She writes, perhaps I can call myself a lucky fellow who has faced a flood of 1 in 100 years only after 3 months and a half of spending life in Chennai. So the forte of the story is the way it captures lived life experience of teaching Japanese for a few months in Chennai and then witnessing the Adyar River flooding. So the flood allows different elements to come together. Personal experience of a Japanese woman in India, teaching Japanese through English to finding medallions, revealing their own history, speaking to her. So this kind of story captures raw personal experience and then gives intensity to the tale, which is very rare for Japanese writers to do. So novel one, as I told you, the 2018 Aktagawa Prize. And one of the judges called the novel a collage pulled out of the mud in a foreign land. A collage pulled out of the mud in a foreign land. So the two novels are not just tales of two rivers, but of two cities, both ancient and modern. And they have their own histories, and they carry a past from the Tenjiku, the earliest times, to the present. Endo gives a very religious and personal identity to the Ganga River. Ishii captures the reality of mud and flood based on her personal experience. So the Ganga dominates the imagination of both Indians and Japanese writers. A very powerful representation of the two cities, and both these writers in their very unique manner show what India is about, but they are always in touch with the changing conceptions of prehistory and how they are to be represented. So with that, I come to the end. Thank you very much for listening. And if there are any questions after Susan speaks or now, whichever the way is, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams, for this wonderful talk on the on this overarching analysis on the different worldviews reflected in the history of Japanese literature. We will have Q&A session after Professor Alias's talk, so please hold on. And if you all have any questions, please feel free to write in the chat box. So let us move on to the next speaker. I'd like to invite Professor Alias from St. Stephen's College, India, who will also give her thoughts on the representation of India in Japanese literature. Over to you, Professor Alias.
Thank you very much, Teramoto Sensei, and thank you to Professor Williams for that wonderful. And of course, as I begin, I would like to also thank the South Asian Research Center of Soka University for organizing this wonderful symposium on representations of Indian Japanese literature, and also for inviting me as a speaker. It is truly my honor. This topic was quite interesting for me at a personal level, because as Professor Teramoto had mentioned, over the past couple of years, thanks to the Soka St. Stephen's collaboration, I have had many instances where I could interact with and speak directly with students from Japan. So often enough, one thinks of Japan through the Indian eyes in this context. But when this topic came to me, which is a relatively new kind of area for me to engage with and think about, it was very fascinating because it gave me a sense of how the Japanese looked at us. In that sense, it came a full circle. And therefore, when I'm looking at the literature, which today specifically I'm looking at the novel Deep River by Shusaku Endo, which Professor Williams already gave us a good sense of and gave a wonderful background too. I'm, particularly thinking about how India as a culture, as a geographical space, is represented in Japanese literature through the idea of translation. And that's what my talk today will focus on. So again, as I begin, I must say that I'm a literature person, so I am looking at this particular novel from that perspective. So Shusaku Endo's Deep River was published in 1993. And this particular novel is based on the journey of a set of tourists from Japan to India. And they are interested primarily in visiting the Buddhist holy sites. And the entire plot unfurls in a couple of days, primarily in a couple of days, with some, flashbacks of these characters' backdrop. And the novel is set in a very interesting and important period of Indian history, which is the year 1984, when we witnessed the assassination of the then Prime Minister, Indira Gandhi, which leads to Hindu, Sikh riots all across. We'll come back to that perhaps towards the end of the talk, but this is the kind of political context that we are looking at. So the narrative traces, of course, as I mentioned, the physical journey of these tourists to India, but also the psychical and the spiritual journey of specifically 4 Japanese individuals. One is Mitsuko Naruse, who is a divorcee. The other is Osamu Isobe, who's a widower. The other is Numada, who is the author of children's fiction. And then you have Kikuchi, who is a former World War II veteran. So you have, and I'm not going into the details of these characters at this particular point, but just to give us, a quick sense, all these characters coming from different points of their life with particular experiences. One person was in the war, comes with the experience of war. One person just went through, an intense psychological trauma. And all these characters in that sense, they're coming with their own question, their own yearnings, their own spiritual angst, and they're coming to India. So this is the large overview in the context of this. Now, this entire group of tourists, they come to India, and the novel primarily focuses on the city of Varanasi, which is a religious hub of Hinduism in India. To me, as somebody from the south of India, now India is a very diverse country, multiple religions, multiple languages, multiple cultures. So for me, who comes from south of India, I'm a Christian, different background, the choice of Varanasi, right? And through Varanasi, as Professor Williams had mentioned, you will look at the representation of River Ganga became particularly interesting. And of course, I don't think it is representative of the whole of India. It doesn't in any capacity capture the entirety of India. And therefore, I would think that the exclusion of other languages, other cultures, other regions of India, or even the metropolitan cities, and the sole focus on Varanasi and the river Ganga may seem problematic, but it is an integral aspect of the representative politics of this particular novel, which locates India as an abode of spirituality and religion, right? So in the course of this presentation, I will be thinking about it through the idea of translation as a literary process as well as a cultural process, right? And at the end of the presentation, I would like to argue that through the representation of India as a space of religion, as a space of spirituality, what you conversely see is also the representation of a certain kind of spiritual crisis that you see in the modern Japanese self, right? So let's begin with this idea of translation. As I was, gathering my thoughts and researching and preparing for this presentation, one of the things which I could not gloss over was the question of literary translations, particularly in terms of the rate of translation or the traffic of translation, right? So here I'm thinking of translation as a literary activity. Now I'm remembering this Indian theorist, his name is, literary theorist, his name is Ijaz Ahmed. Ijaz Ahmed talks about translation, as a literary phenomena. And he talks about how amongst European countries and European languages, the traffic of translation is significant. But whereas when you come to Asian countries, right, you don't see that strong of, that the similar kind of translation, the rate of translation, right? So when I was looking for some of these texts, I was trying to look for them in English. I could find some translations in English, which was still more, and in fact, I could not find any translation in regional languages of many of the Japanese literature. So English is an official language of India, but it is not the official language of India, right? So we have all these other languages. So I momentarily wanted to bring our attention at this point, since we are talking about India and Japan and literature, to think about the availability or the traffic of translations that happen from Japanese to Indian languages, which, as per my understanding, is quite little, right? So one needs to think about the extra literary elements that affect this kind of translation, right? So that is as far as literary translation is concerned. Now, the second aspect of translation here that I want to consider is the idea of translation not just as a literary process, but as a cultural and as a social process, right? And this I can think of with respect to this particular novel. So Shusaku Endo's Deep River is a novel which is obviously written by a Japanese author, and it presents the reflections and observations and experience of Japanese characters, experiences of India through the eyes of Japanese characters. It is only, once in a while that you have Indian characters speaking or talking about India, right? So what is interesting here is the representation of India as you see in this particular novel, quite literary, right? And also thematically, is coming or constituted through the Japanese gaze, right? The eye of the Japanese. So how do characters understand and process India? And this is where I kind of bring in the idea of translation. Now, primarily, because we have only about 20 minutes, of which I'm sure I already took up 10, I would like to primarily highlight two aspects of the novel, which I think connects to the larger point that I'm trying to make. One is, of course, the representation of the river Ganga, or the Ganges, which Professor Williams talked to us about. So the entirety of this novel, in a sense, focuses, as I mentioned, on the city of Varanasi and the river Ganga, which is the central focus of that city, right? River Ganga is a holy river in India, for those of you who are unfamiliar. River Ganga is a long river that flows from the north of India, from the Himalayas, across India and Bangladesh and Nepal and China. So it's a very long river that flows through the Gangetic plain. Now, there are two aspects that you see. In one, primarily this river is a dominant symbol of spirituality in this particular novel. But I would also like to argue that in many senses, it becomes a synecdoche of India itself to the Japanese mind. And I would like to think through that through two elements. One is, of course, the physical descriptions of the river, right? The material aspects. So, for instance, when the text introduces Ganga to us, we are told that the color of the river is yellow. And the color of the river Yamuna, which is a tributary, is gray. And the confluence of these two rivers is described as milky gray, quite dirty, right? We are also looking at the surroundings, the ghats, right, around this particular river being dirty, highly populated. You find all kinds of people from the lower classes, the lower castes. And you're looking at a chaotic, kind of very dirty, unclean space that you see here on the one hand. On the other hand, as was mentioned, you see that this river has an immense spiritual significance in the novel, right? So we are told through the novel that Indians believed that once you enter this river, once you dip in the river Ganga, all your sins will be washed away. That in the next birth, you will be born in better circumstances. There is this idea of reincarnation or rebirth that becomes important here, right? And, there are the synonyms that you see, or the descriptions of the river Ganga that you see are river of rebirth, deep river, river of humanity, the sorrows of humanity as in some senses absorbed by this river. The river is also described as motherly river. So what you see here is an interesting representation of the Ganges, where river Ganga represent contradictions, which in many ways the Japanese mind is trying to reconcile with, right? On the one hand, it's so unclean. On the other hand, it is spiritual, right? And throughout the text, you see this being referred, right? So you have characters saying that in this country, being pretty and being holy are not the same. Rivers are sacred to India. Even characters eventually realize that this river, just like this particular river, that is River Ganga, you see a confluence of purity and defilement, holiness and obscenity, charity and brutality mingle and coexisting as in India. Right? So look at how contradictions become a way through which the Japanese psyche, as you see in the novel, try to navigate and process and understand India. The second aspect, which becomes, so one is River Ganga, the representation of Ganga, and the second is the figure of the goddess, which becomes very important in this particular novel. So as you know, before the Japanese tourists travel to India, you have the travel guide giving a presentation to the tourists and introducing India to the tourists. And one of the images that he shows is the image of goddess Kali. Now, goddess Kali is presented as standing with one foot trampling on the corpse of a man. Her neck is adorned with severed human heads. And she is this horrid image, this horrific image. Along with goddess Kali, you also see another goddess. This is goddess Chamunda, right? Chamundeshwari or Chamunda, who lives in graveyards. Whose body is afflicted by leprosy, whose belly is caved in with hunger, who consists of saggy breasts, but she provides milk to her devotees or her children. So you're looking at these images of female Shakti, right? Or the female power, not through your Aryan goddesses, right? I mean, goddesses such as Lakshmi, who's a goddess, Saraswati, goddess of learning, or and so on and so forth. But you have these other images of the goddess, the Kali, the image of Kali, Chamunda. And in this context, you have also other goddesses such as Shitala Mata in Hinduism, or down in South India, you have Mariamman, etc., etc. So I would like to connect this representation, this image of the goddess, to the representation of the river Ganga too. Because if you look at these goddesses, they also occupy an ambiguous position, right? On the one hand, these goddesses are divine, but on the other hand, they are human-like, right? Their bodies are infested. They carry the pain and suffering much like humanity. Their bodies are in that sense inflicted, and yet they are prayed to. And they, in many senses, become an index of human suffering, right? So these goddesses who then represent the physical struggles of humanity, yet at the same time demonstrate the inner spiritual strength to her devotees, is yet again an interesting and important representation of contradictions and ambiguities when you look at India. So the river Ganga, the representation of Kali and Chamunda, both of these images, in that sense, through the Japanese mind, presents a certain kind of contradiction, which is very difficult to negotiate with and navigate with. And it is at this point, and I would like to, do I have 5 more minutes, Professor Teramoto? Yeah. Perfect. Thank you very much.
Yes, Professor Alias. You could have another 10 minutes, please.
Oh, great.
Go ahead.
Yes, great. And I would like to kind of then argue that, this kind of tussle, this kind of ambiguity that you see is also bringing in this idea of untranslatability into our, so every time we think of translation as a process, we constantly think of translation as a very easy, we think of it in from the perspective that there can be an easy movement of meanings, ideas, and cultures from one place to the other, one source text to another text, right? But of late, we have, of course, in translation studies, this idiom of untranslatability that becomes very important, right? That which cannot be translated, or that which cannot be encompassed in language. So through the psychical struggles, for all these characters, these images, these experiences mean something. There is a kind of a spiritual transformation or satisfaction that they receive at the end of it. And I would think that we can think of the idea of untranslatability from this perspective, right? Of that which cannot be explained by the bounds of language. Through the, there is a certain limitation of language that exists. So that is one aspect which I think that one needs to think about. And through this, therefore, I would again suggest that as you think of untranslatability, you can also think of and one ought to rather think of translation as an interpretative process, right? Translation is also an act of understanding, right? It's a hermeneutic process. You're thinking about an object, you're processing. This is your understanding of the world. So when you see India in that sense, when you see the geographical space of India, which is represented in a 20th century, late 20th century Japanese fiction, what you also see is a certain interpretation of India, right? Through a very kind of, defined set of parameters. And to me, this mode of interpretation is also then telling of the interpreter, right? It is also then a particular way through which the Japanese self defines itself against the other, right? So that dialectical process is important. The self is also getting constituted through the other, through what it is encountering. The self is realizing itself and defining itself through the other, which it is encountering, engaging with, and in the process, engaging in a dialogue, in the process, understanding, right? So when you look at these texts, what one also, therefore, I would think see is, several instances where there are constant comparisons between Japan and India in an attempt to understand India. So one is, as Professor Williams had mentioned, right, and going back to create connections here, is to think about how, in this novel, you see that India is constantly compared to as, as in a state that represents a Japanese past. Sometimes it's a prehistoric past, but sometimes it is a past that people have forgotten, which is quite immediate. So for instance, when there is this scene of a village, people are sitting in a village, animals of an Indian village one evening, you have animals right next to you, somebody's making milk, tea, all of that is going on. The Japanese onlooker says, oh, this is so strange, this is so new. You have animals and humans sitting side by side. Or look at the poverty that you see in India. And as these comments are made, there is a character, Kikuchi, who is a veteran of World War II. He says that, oh, these people know nothing about post-war Japan, hunger and poverty that existed there, right? Or you have another character, Numada, who is a writer of children's fiction. He says, in olden days in Japan, we could see animals and humans sitting side by side, just as you see here in this village, right? So there is a certain way in which India is, as we discussed, positioned as this domain of spirituality. But when you look at the temporal frame of things, you also see that India is located in the past of the Japanese self, who is more advanced, more modern, right, in that sense. But yet again, what you also see is a certain kind of spiritual crisis that the modern self, the Japanese self, seems to experience, which is then locating India as the space which contains the answers for this loss of identity, this loss of spirituality, right? So therefore, when you think of translation, one has to think of the idiom of every act of representation is a mode of translation, first of all, right? And when you think of translation, one has to engage with translation as a process and not as an act, right? And what are the parameters that are enmeshed in this process, right? Translation as one that has an element of the untranslatable, which is then often represented through literature in terms of contradictions. And that unknowability is what that grips, that's very gripping about this particular narrative. Similarly, translation also works with this idea of loss, of that which is not with me any longer, that which I'm looking for, right? With it, there's always that idiom of loss that is in translation. And of course, lastly, there is this ethical function of translation, right? Where you are trying to understand the other through the translation. So therefore, for me, I think this is a very interesting project that we are looking at, because we're looking at, and again, when you look at literary representations of India in Japanese literature, that is only a couple of decades old. It doesn't have a long-standing history. It's in the latter half of the 20th century that you see all these literary representations of. So I think it's a very good process for us to start thinking about the limitations and the possibilities that is opened up in these modes of representations, as you see in Trisapu Endo's River. So I would like to bring my short presentation to an end on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Alias, for your wonderful talk. Now we have heard from two professors on their thoughts on the representations of India in Japanese literatures. Just for those who have joined us later, first talk by Professor Williams dealt with overarching analysis of the history of Japanese, of the history of representations of India in Japanese literature. And he's referred to different kinds of world views reflected in the writings by Japanese authors. Often Japanese authors use the concept of Tenjiku, India, as a Buddhist land, and used Buddhist cosmology highly reflected in their stories and narratives. Later on in the 19th and 20th century, the idea of Asia is one, which was spread amongst Japanese intellectuals then, was also reflected in literature. Professor Williams also mentioned about the certain perspectives in relation to Buddhism reflected in the later literature by Japanese, which are reincarnation and moksha, and life is chaos. So thank you very much, Professor Williams. Next speaker, Professor Alias, has proposed to us different perspectives, focusing on a Japanese famous writer, Endo Shusaku, who's written a very renowned book called The Deep River, or Fukaikawa in Japanese, published in 1993. She has proposed us with important aspects that the two distinctive imageries were written in the story. One is the representations of the Ganga, the holy river in India, and the representation of the goddesses, particularly goddess Kali, and how Japanese author used these imageries to, and as a result, provides with a certain image of India. She has also pointed out an important aspect of the process of translation, and which hasn't been looked at much, in contrast with the process of translation from English to other from the local vernaculars to the English, or perhaps from English to European languages, I suppose. In comparison, the translation of Japanese literatures into English, the process itself it hasn't been looked at much. So we have different and interesting arguments presented by two speakers, and I would like to thank both of you for thought-provoking talk. And I would like to open the discussion to the floor so that we can ask questions or make comments freely. We have two ways to do that. One, I would like you to unmute yourself and directly speak to the talkers today, or you could type into the chat box so that we can read your question out loud for the speakers. So let us take a minute or two and see if anyone would like to directly ask questions and make comments.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Professor Rajesh.
Okay, so I have a question here. See, more often than not, when it comes to representing India in their works, writers, especially foreign writers, end up portraying some parts of northern India, as pointed out by Professor Alias. Southern India usually attracts scant attention. Now, for instance, this particular novel which I'm going to talk about has not been written by a Japanese writer. The writer is E.M. Foster. Consider the novel titled A Passage to India. Okay, I think the title of this novel should have been A Passage to Chandrapur. So the question is it possible to fully represent India, not just religious or spiritual India, in literary works? Or should we regard representation as a meaningless word?
Thank you very much, Professor Rajesh. May I ask if this question is directed to both of the speakers, or?
Yeah, it's kind of, I wrote it down. I was reading it aloud. I thought I was supposed to, paste it in the chat box. So anyone can answer it. I just want to know, not trying to corner anybody.
Thank you very much, Professor Rajesh.
Perhaps if I could take this up, not really take this up, but just to share the thoughts. And thank you so much, Professor Rajesh, for that. Because like I said, when I was reading this particular text and I was looking at the history of representations of Indian and Japanese literature, I was struck that it was constantly centering around Northern India. And my location, as I mentioned, from someone from Southern India, a Christian, I was thinking how, there is that, absence, there is that vacuum that exists, and often, and I'm not sure, and perhaps Professor Williams can sort of shed light on this. I was wondering if there is an acknowledgement of, if there is a deviation from this mode of representation that one largely sees. Just to add in here, initially when I was, and that is why when I opened up, I was also thinking about how this novel has, the particular novel that I was looking at, had the Japanese gaze. You had the Japanese tourists introducing India, you had the observations from all these other characters, but none from really India, right? No Indian really speaks except for remarks here and there. So I thought about it as, and I thought about it in the line of, I'm not sure if some of you are familiar, there is this very famous criticism that Chinua Achebe makes against Joseph Conrad in this essay called An Image of Africa, where he says in Conrad's work, which is it's a celebrated work of, it's a European male work, which is celebrated as part of modernism. And Achebe says, when you look at that text, no African speaks. Africa is always depicted as the realm of prehistory. And you see that, it is always this area where the European self is looking for spirituality. And very similar kind of, arguments. So when I was thinking about it, I was also thinking that the author is perhaps also being quite aware of the limitations of representation. And the reason why I say it is precisely because the author does not have any Indian characters speaking, right? Because ultimately, when that happens, it is the author giving voice to an Indian. The question and the politics of representation and who has the right to representation comes. So I thought it was a very smart way of creating an insularity, against that mode of criticism, a certain kind of framing, so that there is at no point the potential or the suggestion that he is trying to represent all of India. But I really would like to see, that, more works, because again, you don't see any of the metropolitan cities. You have Calcutta that is referred to occasionally, but it is again referred to in the same terms as chaotic, dirty, and all of that. So I would really hope, and I think this, in that sense, is an important process to see if there exist other literatures that represent India differently, and B, this should, in some senses, be a starting point to more such endeavors, to look beyond perhaps the northern belt, to look at India beyond spirituality, especially given that we have, ever since 1952, we have, a strong kind of diplomatic, international kind of allegiance between these two nations. Yeah, that is just my thoughts, just to add on to what Professor Rajesh said.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Elias. I have other questions. Here is a question for both of the speakers. Please explain, please tell us how unique the representation are. By that, I think the question means, are these representations of India particularly unique to Japan, or is a way of representation similar in the foreign literatures? This is one question. And another question is...
Let's take one at a time. So I just want to say a few things. The word representation is coming up many times. And Rajesh talked about fully represent. Writers don't fully represent anything. And we shouldn't expect too much from writers or from literature in that sense. I think it is to do with the quality of a sensibility of a writer. He's a olfactory or pictorial writer, what kind of writer he is, what kind of selection he makes, the quality of the problem that he presents in a story, and that will decide the representation, what kind of representation he brings to his story. Whether there is a resolution in the story or not in the story, and which will be directly connected to the problem that is reflected in the story. The familiarity he has with his terrain, especially I'm talking about Japanese writers representing India. Their familiarity is very low. So the fact that they do represent, it is very hard to find Japanese writers representing India, as Susan would explain that. Very hard to find. The familiarity with the local languages. When these writers go, they may not understand anything. I talked about Ishi Yuka, and that answers your question. She writes about South India. She writes about Chennai and the flooding of the Adyar River. And she got the Aktagawa Prize for the best story. Understanding. Now, the word understanding is very important. It is not like the European or Indian understanding of a foreign country. As I mentioned to you, that certain vocabularies are introduced, certain images are introduced. So basically what I'm trying to say, that no writer, especially Japanese writer, are very much located within the religious and the iconographic tradition and the philosophy of Japan. And from that perspective, they observe and watch. I mentioned to you Mishima. Mishima is a writer who sets the standard for most writers, including Endo and Ishii. And the kind of images, the kind of reactions that they show are predominantly those of Mishima. So Mishima is somebody who creates a certain image and a way of looking and a perspective. So I mean, a writer, especially in Japan, this is the point I'm making. In Japan, it is not possible for the writer to escape completely the religious and the literary tradition. And more so, he is located within that tradition. So I mentioned to you these 7 worldviews. Within these 7 worldviews, Japanese writers must find their meaning. You certainly can't jump and write something absolutely fantastic and new. So this is one point. And fully representation is just not possible. And it's looking for the Holy Grail, literally. And one shouldn't. Why should one do that? It's meaningless to write something which is all-encompassing and complete. It's a way a scholar may look at it. This is not represented and that is not represented. It's not the business of a writer. If it is not represented, it is not represented. How does it really matter? This is my story and this is my story. The other thing is about translation. I mean, Teramoto Sensei and I, we did Hyakun and Doro and some parts of it. It is really tough because the Japanese language that Ishii uses runs on and on and on and on. There is no break in the language. You know that. And the sentences won't stop, and we need a full stop. We need a comma somewhere. Where do you put them? And the moment you put, the whole thing is gone. Here are scholars, Japanese scholars, who are saying fantastic work. We are saying not at all. I mean, where are we? Translatability, all that. Yeah, I mean, the languages are different. Also, Japanese language is very minimalist. We don't say many things that need to be said. Now, how do you say that in any language for that matter? It's of a very different variety and a superior quality. I mean, you can ask senseis here, he's a professor of Japanese, he would tell you that how it is, even for Japanese writers, Japanese readers to understand what the Japanese writers are saying sometimes. And we felt the problem. So, hard to say all these things. Yeah, I mean, Ejaz Ahmed talked about all those things, but he's given up on all those ideas now. He writes something very different. This was great stories earlier, but now translation we have in Japan, good and bad translation. So that's all. This one is a good translation. That it doesn't mean it conforms completely to what the writer has said. I mean, good means 30%, 40%, 50%. That kind of thing is more readable and easy to access. That is my take on it. And Professor Sharma has written here questions for Professor Williams. Yeah.
Yes. I just would like to briefly add to what Professor Williams said, that the translation from Japanese into English has a particular difficulty that we don't always use subject in the sentence. And if translated in English, subject is the first thing that must be there. And the beauty of Japanese writing lies to quite an extent in the ambiguity of the phrase, that we can imagine what is it about. Although Professor Yamaoka would be a better person to
yeah, he would tell you more about it.
But I just wanted to add this before we move on to the question of Dr. Sharma. So here is a question from Dr. Sharma. Thank you very much. It is about it is about where do the Indian mythological books like Srimad Bhagavad Gita, Ramayana, and Gita stand in Japanese literature. Effects of these books on the continuity of life, past, present, and future, and also the effect of karma in relation to the writing of literature in Japanese.
Yeah, I mean, thank you very much, Sharmaji. Very nice questions, both of them. And I would talk about karma. Karma is a very important idea that percolates in Japanese thought, and especially with Mishima. Mishima was battling with his own life, and I mean, in fact, the last book that he submitted, and immediately after that, he committed suicide. So he grappled with this idea of karma, and yet his biographers tell us that he didn't believe in it very much, and yet he talks about karma. So it is not necessary that a writer, even if he presents a philosophical thought, he endorses it in his real life. There are lots and lots of writers who write about ideas, but their life is very different. So we cannot attribute the philosophical ideas which are endorsed in the story to that of the writer. This is one point. The other one is the myths that are there in Indian myths through the Bhagavad Gita, through whether they are available to people in daily life. They are not available. However, there are plays that are there which are based on the Bhagavad Gita. There are people who are elites who very much access the writings of the Bhagavad Gita, who access Ramayana and Mahabharata, but it is not available. And suddenly you will find a manga talking about Gita, ideas of. So, I mean, I think manga and anime are quite progressive in that sense. I gave you the example of the Tenjiku arc. And a lot of new writing may talk about it, but they don't know much. That is my take on both the concept of karma. It is very heavy, it comes very strongly. And all the writers after Mishima have picked up on the concept of karma, on the river, on all kinds of things. Ishii has done that, connecting it to all kinds of stories of the past, her own life in Osaka and so on. But generally speaking, karma is something that has percolated into the Japanese consciousness through Buddhism and so on. But lessening of karmic retribution and so forth, they are all there. But not so much Brahminical spirituality, which is available in gods and goddesses in Japan. It is available through the Bij mantra or the Siddham, through the Siddham script in Japan. But generally, people are not aware. The common people are not aware of these ideas. That's my take.
Thank you, Professor Williams. There is another question for Professor Alias, which is about translation. The question is, could you please tell us more about the translation being process and not as an act that you spoke in?
Yes,
Yes.
before? Thank you. Thank you for that question. What one meant with that is to, often enough, as I had mentioned in my presentation, when we think of translation, we think of it as a ready process or a ready act of, exchanging meaning, transporting meaning from one language to another. But there are two ways of thinking about it. One is, as was just mentioned in the discussion here itself, there are histories to concepts. There are histories to language itself, right? In fact, there are particular ways in which a language is coded, a language is structured, which has much to do with the culture, right? So often when we use the term act, or when you think of translation in a limited capacity as an action which immediately translates meaning from one source to another, that is really not the case. You have to be cognizant of the processes that is involved, right? The process in terms of me, if I were to translate, that is involved with me translating a work, right? My location as a 21st century woman writing in a particular place, how do I read that text? How do I interpret that text, right? So that is, I mean, and also in the way, the process in which I physically think, write, translate. The second layer to it is to understand the history of the language itself, right? From which you are translating from and to which you're translating into. What are the limitations? What are the possibilities? What are the kind of bridges that you can bring, right? So when you think, when you're cognizant of these larger processes, you will no longer think of translation as a synchronic, kind of process, as something that happens now here and it's a ready availability of meaning, but rather as a process in itself, which doesn't remain complete through the translator, right? It also is actualized in the act of reading that particular work, right? So we have to think of the larger processes involved in translation. And this is important because often especially in texts, I can speak for Indian texts, where the language is not as, of course, not standardized or as transparent as it is available now, whereas there is, density in the kind of language, when there is high symbolism, when language is opaque in that sense, you see that there are multiple translations. Different people translate, different people interpret concepts differently, right? So in translational studies, we also look at these very many translations, the history of translations itself when it comes to a text, right? And on that note, just to kind of add in here, when one was talking about the rate of translation, etc., or one also has to understand that it is a needed process, right? It is an ethical act. You are trying to understand. We as human beings and as communities, whatever the limitations be, we have to try and understand the other. It is an ethical act, right? And it is a dialogue, right? You understand yourself through the other. And we are always engaged. As scholars, we are always engaged in these dialogues, and that is important. So the process of translation never really ends. And it is not purely a literary process. It is a social process. It is a cultural process, right? Which also has all these other dimensions that go into it, right? So that kind of perspective is something that I think we should have, as opposed to thinking about it in limited terms as an easy access to meaning. I hope that helps in some way.
Thank you very much, Professor Alias. We are nearing the end of the discussion, but we have one more question, although we have 3 minutes left. This is a question by a graduate student. She says she came very late, so maybe this has already been discussed. But if there is time, I'd like to know if the Japanese writers represent India positively or not, or is there a change in the way the writers think of India? Perhaps Professor Williams?
Well, I would say that Japanese writers who never saw India presented India in a very positive light. And recently, especially Yuka Ishii, Shakunen Doro, presents India, especially Chennai, in a very different way. And she brings out all the terrible aspects that you can imagine about. That's why I use the phrase life as chaos worldview, and pulling out children who are half dead from the water, from the, many things, though she is not um, very good with symbolism and so on, and difficult to say because uses a lot of magic realism, shifting perspectives, and so on. But well, it did get the Aktakawa Award for the best novel a couple of years ago. So it is not presented in a very positive, and also Endo. Some parts are okay. I mean, they're very authentic, but there is a scene in the end where the one of the characters is he dies. He is killed. He falls and he's beaten up, and So I mean, there is a lot of violence that is represented in the stories of both Endo and Ishii. So I don't know that whether they represent in a positive light, but undoubtedly, in the past, when people didn't see India, the representation was very positive, the pure land and the far away but the pure land, and how it was rich in cultural heritage. It had a lot of conceptions which are translated into Japanese language as very positive. And the stories that come from India are very positive, and because it was the birthplace of Buddhism, it was seen in a very, very positive light. And so the shifting perspectives over the centuries, when I'm talking over the centuries, I'm talking about in the 6th century onwards, because the trade with what is called the Buddhist trade began in the 6th century, much before the emperor wanted to make Buddhism as a main religion. There was trade that was taking place, and the Sangha became quite rich during that time, and artifacts and so on were being traded, and the ships were moving, and that is one of the reasons why some people came to Japan in the 8th century, after 200 years. So images were very positive until you come to the early 20th century. Even then, people like Subhash Chandra Bose and so on are seen in a very positive light in Japan, though people haven't written much on Subhash Chandra Bose at all, literary scholars or writers. But he's seen as a god, literally. In Japan, I attended one of the functions of the death anniversary at what Renkoji temple, at Renkoji temple, and there was this lunch after that, and there were very old people who were sitting and eating lunch and drinking beer, and they said, we have a deep respect. He's like Kami-sama. He's like a god. So there are very positive images of India in the past, but the present images, if they are good images, they are old images. They are images from the past. And the new images aren't very many, because unless Japanese people go and live there and, make it their home, and some of them are writers who do write, you would not find so many things. And the images that tourists have about Japan, about India, is not a very positive one. So this is my take, and I think Ishii is the only writer of modern times, present times, who has written a novel which has received a lot of attention, especially Hyakunandoro. And that's the only novel that she has written. I hope she does write some more. But that is not translated yet. So that's my take. The past has been good in terms of a positive image.
Thank you very much, Professor Williams. I think we have successfully covered all the questions. Thank you very much for the participants for such a wonderful discussion. And of course, thank you to Professor Alias and Professor Williams for such wonderful and thought-provoking talk. We are now officially closing the symposium, and before we do so, I would like to request you all to give a round of big applause virtually to the speakers today. Thank you so much.